boundaries between creative disciplines are blurring these days. We're talking about the subject today on Impostor Cities, which is itself talking about, taking streets to screens, as you and your one of your movie only said it.
Well, that's definitely how I think both David and I kind of run our kind of different sides of architecture. I mean, both of us teach, involved in exhibitions. I practice. David does a lot of scholarly research as well. So it kind of covers the gamut of what architecture is about, in the real spectrum, not in the kind of day-to-day change orders and construction, but I mean, kind of real architecture that has a certain perennity over time and a certain impact on the lives of people. That's one of the reasons why we're interested in film for all sorts of reasons, but it's funny, often accessing architecture through other media, like film, makes it more real for other people who are not architects, who are not used to it. You can walk past the same building every day and it's kind of meaningless to you. You see it in a movie, presented in a different light, and all of a sudden it's something that has a kind of importance. So, it was important for us to kind of explore how 99% of the world sees architecture, not how the 1% of architects who, as you say, like to talk to other architects, see architecture.
When we saw there is a certain thematic to this year's Biennale, and you've taken that thematic and created an Impostor City that really caught our attention, and we realized that there is, there's so much which is happening on the screen today. And that's the first thing which, when we were looking at your video on La Biennale website, where you talked about Impostor City, and what came to our mind is that most of us, and some of us in today's generation, you see Games of Thrones, and the way architecture has been layered there, and the way fantasy is being created there, it's nothing but pure. If you flip it aside, it is impostering the living environment. And then Christopher Nolan also did a movie called Inception, and again you see it was centered around the way the architecture was presented or projected on the screen. So we really found your thematic of your pavilion quite interesting, and we thought it'd be great to hear more from both of you, and let the audience know in detail in terms of the direction you've taken for this Biennale.
I just want to say quickly that Inception was partly filmed in Alberta in Canada, so impostering there.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, as one of your member on the video said, that most of the cities, most of the movies which States has put together were shot in Toronto and a large part of Canada, and they add layers to those built environment which is in street, but what you see in movies is complete fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, it is fantasy, and you mentioned things like Inception, where the artifice is very visible, but in a lot of these movies the artifice goes by unnoticed. So Toronto is a primary location, but Vancouver is also more in the TV series world, highly used for different reasons. Winnipeg as well. Montreal also for more kind of period pieces, especially the older parts of the city. So the whole country is kind of exploited and used for this artifice that often is subtle and unnoticeable, not so grandiose like you would see in Inception, Doctor Strange, or anything that tries to collage or recreate unreal worlds. It's very much about the Ghost Protocol, Mission Impossible. Vancouver plays Mumbai, plays Moscow, plays a few other places around the world as well. Within the space of 5 minutes, they're jumping from one city to another, but they're still in Vancouver. And
Yeah.
if you've been to Vancouver, you kind of start to recognize, past all of the kind of makeup and kind of construction, very Canadian buildings, which are still kind of mind-blowing in a way.
What was the detailed intent and the purpose on this thematic of imposter cities, which came around when you started when you spoke to the Venice Biennale curator?
It was a competition. It was a Canadian competition
Mm-hmm.
to be selected. So Hasim Sarkis and the topic of the Biennale is revealed later. Canada is one of the earlier countries to select its representatives. So we were lucky that our idea kind of matched with what Hashim had selected, and crazily enough, with the pandemic and everything, it made our project even more relevant. As you said, everybody's glued to their screens, and our kind of connection with the world now is so much through that. Whether it's on our phone or on our computer. So everything kind of just fell into place slowly. An idea that we thought was kind of interesting because our city is so, I think, chameleon-like.
So our competition was not so much around a theme, but just what do you want to present in the gallery to an international set of visitors? So the process is a little bit different than it might seem from the outside. Where the idea came from, though, is as always, where does an idea come from? So we had a dozen ideas, which we sort of slowly got bored of. And the one that we really, really liked and got more and more excited about was this one about imposter cities. So there's probably still, I'm a kind of frustrated architect in that what I do is I teach and I do research. I don't get to build anything. Tom is luckier, he gets to build stuff. So there's still another 5 Biennale that I would like to do, because so rarely get to get these ideas out. But this one really has just such great response to it right away. Everybody has had been somewhere where they've seen something being filmed in their city. They've seen the yellow taxi cabs in their cities trying to be New York. Everybody loves the stars. Oh, I saw so-and-so in my coffee shop. It's really, really been fun, as well as this worry about screens and screens overtaking our lives, kind of confinement from COVID and so on. But it's really it's an adventure. It's not really that we just had this one straight idea that matches the theme and then zoom, we kind of show up in the pavilion. It's really a lot of collaboration and working through the ideas like that.
If you have to describe the purpose of Impostor City as an idea, what would you say?
The purpose? I mean, other than to raise awareness of something that maybe people take for granted, not just the idea of impostering, but also Canadian architecture that is rich and varied. The project has many layers, so on a kind of more vulgar layer, I would say, are those ideas. On a more academic layer would definitely be the kind of, what does it mean for architecture to be read this way, to be interpreted this way, when we as architects all the time really champion our projects being very specific to their place, to their climate, to their political situation, to economics, and all of these things that are culturally specific, we think. And then lo and behold, architecture is read very differently by filmmakers, by people consuming the films. And sometimes, you have to wonder if that actually isn't a more accurate reading of architecture. So that question that David loves to summarize in what I think is a great couple of sentences, It's about identity and it's about faking it. I think there's something there that, from a research point of view, really needs to be kind of excavated.
Well, I would say it slightly differently. When we were going through the lists of film and TV shows, there are films, I'm trying to think of a famous one, and it's not coming to me right now, that are shot, say, in Montreal, because Montreal has a booming film industry. We have great crews, we have lots of technology is available, hotels are cheap for Americans, there's lots of reasons to come and shoot a film here. But if they didn't actually show Montreal pretending to be somewhere else, even if they were shot in Montreal, we still didn't include them in our exhibition. So the other kind of one is in Montreal is a city in Canada, but it's also the biggest city in Quebec. And it speaks, in Montreal, we speak, the language is French, as opposed to the international language of film, which is English. So in French Quebec film, Montreal plays Montreal most often. It's the big city where everybody goes to realize their dreams or get into trouble or, find love. Whereas the international filmmakers who come and use Montreal tend to make it Boston or New York or Paris is a favorite one. And they treat it differently. So to do that, you actually have to go out into the streets, film the streets as if you were filming Paris. And it just makes for a very different kind of city. In one set of cinema, Mumbai plays Mumbai, Los Angeles plays itself, as the thing goes. That's one kind of phenomenon about how cities get filmed. We're just much more fascinated by the one where downtown Vancouver can stand in for North Korea. How is that possible? Like, how is that possible? It's supposed to be so different politically, culturally, climatically. The architects are interested in their local communities and their building for the people who will be using the buildings and so on. But no, it can look like anywhere else. So we think that, anyway, I think that's a lot of fun. I think it's part of what we really wanted to get in the middle of the Biennale, was a place where you could go and actually enjoy yourself, as we say, with your entire body. It will be fun to kind of, the vision was that the screens would be big enough that you could actually kind of walk around inside of these imposter cities as you were there. You wouldn't just be looking at your little handheld screen. It would be so big that you could be part of part of Vancouver pretending to be North Korea at the exhibition. And we just thought that actually doing that and taking the images you see in the films seriously as an architectural experience rather than a cinematic experience, just switch people's thinking around a little bit to see it not so much as a problem, oh, why are cities so generic that they can be anywhere, but this other kind of way, what is the magic that's going on there that allows us to dream somehow through these films about our cities in some kind of way. The negative part is definitely there, but there's a real positive part that's both pleasurable, pleasure is important, and kind of stimulating. What kind of cities do we make now that we know that our cities are mostly going to be seen in a movie rather than by somebody going in there and listening to a concert or something?
Is there a connection between what you'd call the imposter syndrome and the individual to a sort of larger transmission to cities, and how do you think one affects the other?
Kind of a general undercurrent in Canadian culture. I think that's kind of integrated into our living situation, whether it's architecture, professionally speaking, or just generally in our lives. As a kind of a new country that's very I wouldn't quite say diverse, but that is composed by a lot of things that aren't necessarily native to the way we live our lives in cities. I think everybody as a Canadian generally feels somewhat like the imposter. The title itself, is very provocative, or the intention was that it be provocative and kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke at our own kind of feelings about our cultural identity.
Yeah, Toronto is always trying to become a world-class city, and they never quite seem to get there. Just on the title, though, would say too, So we generic was another word that we used for a while and sometimes still do. There's a way that somehow Boston, London, Berlin, Montreal, Toronto, LA all can look the same in a generic kind of way, especially with the kind of glass wall and concrete or steel skyscrapers that are going up. You can take those buildings and put them in any city, it seems. But when we tried to get an Italian translation for it, they really didn't like the word imposter. That really seemed like the mafia or the criminals are imposters. It was really as if you were suggesting that it was truly harmful and corrupt. Whereas in English, it doesn't quite mean. It's more like it can still have that playful part that we liked, where you might impersonate somebody. Let's say impersonating cities rather than imposters. And some of the people that we interviewed for the film really people in the film industry objected a little bit to that kind of idea too, that there's something bad about being imposters. They said, look, what actors do is they impersonate other people and we give them, prizes for being good at doing that. You should give a city a prize if it can stand in for a whole bunch of other cities. It should be seen as a great thing that the city is so capable of pretending to be other places, in the same way that we might get really excited about a very good actor.
Impostor Cities, I think, raises a lot of important questions about context in architecture and a global sort of architecture. So how close are we to the answers through Impostor Cities? As in, have you figured out, or do we have a definitive answer as to why Canada or why Canadian cities? I just heard Tom say about, something about Canadian cities being this sort of melting pot of cultures. How is that translating into the architecture that makes it so suitable as a stage for cinema of anywhere, let's just say even of Europe or of America?
I wouldn't say melting pot of cultures. Maybe I misspoke. It's more of a melting pot of influences, I think would be a clear way to say it.
Canada dislikes the melting pot idea. That's the bad United States. In Canada, we prefer multiculturalism, where you're allowed to be a Canadian and something else at the same time. That's the idea. And that's just it. We have Expo 67, which is one of the major events in architecture in Canada ever, is famous for a whole bunch of architects from around the world coming to build at Expo 67 and then staying. So the sense we have of what architecture in Canada is after 1967 isn't just because of what Canadians were interested in already. It's what all these other people from around the world who came to work on Expo 67 contributed to what happened next in all kinds of ways, urban planning, etc. It's just a huge wave of people who changed the way things are. So that does contribute a little bit to this feeling that we're imposters. A little bit, right? We're not actually Canadians either, in a certain kind of way.
I think everybody's excited about seeing the possibility in architecture. And I think we as architects often try to shut the door or narrow things down and kind of reduce potential to something that is clear. And I think it's in the lack of clarity that sometimes you get closer through the stories, through all of these things, to what something might actually be. And Amal, to answer your question, it wasn't so much about do we have an answer. It's just we're wrapping our heads around the questions that we should be asking.
In one of your notes, you said that imposter city is troublesome rather than specific, or it's interesting rather than comfortable.
Well, we think it's troublesome that something can be more than one thing at once, or it's not what we thought it was going to be, or it's not what we as designers intended it to be. We think it's troublesome, but maybe that's not true either.
There are similar kinds of things. One of the fun things about watching all of these sometimes very, very bad films is how often they blow up the buildings.
David likes the bad films.
I do. But almost, you have famous buildings that architects think are really great, and then the first thing a filmmaker does is explode it on film, right? And sometimes several times. So that's just curious. Why, if these buildings are, is it because like why would they do that? Why would we want to watch films that do that to our buildings? What is it that makes us want to blow up all of these famous buildings? So that was one kind of question. The other one that we got in cataloging like thousands and thousands of these films and TV shows was how few how few of the buildings are associated with how do I say this properly? The only architect that we found who had multiple buildings consistently used in films is Arthur Erickson. So Arthur Erickson died, 10 years ago now? Built maybe Canada's most famous architect of the 20th century. Maybe Safdie is more famous because of Habitat. He's really the only person whose buildings get used over and over again, and different buildings. There's also John Andrews Scarborough College, which gets used a lot. But the rest of them there really weren't architects. The subject of the films is not what architects think of as good buildings. Let me put it that way. Does that make sense? So you couldn't go through the list of famous buildings and they've all been used. They were chosen for other reasons other than what architects would normally think of as a good reason. Do they blow up well? Seems to have been a good reason to choose a building in a film, as opposed to, what's the floor plan like or something. You never get an idea of the floor plan from looking at a movie, right? Whereas architects are obsessed with floor plans. So people are not obsessed with floor plans might be the thing. They're obsessed with something else about architecture that architects, if you just go from the architect's point of view, you'll just never get to. So that's one of the things about looking at the film. You can find other things out about the architecture. And part of the thing is it just shifts the hierarchy of what buildings are important, which buildings are well done, which buildings are beautiful. Beauty is an important part of films, maybe more so than in architecture, where we tend not to talk about it. Whereas even in a bad film, everybody on the film is trying to make it look good. Can't always say that about buildings, right?
So David, what do you think is the responsibility that film has toward architecture? What is the right way, or what is the best way for film to approach architecture in this regard?
Well, I was referring to that a little bit before. There are just multiple ways. We were working for a little bit with some people at Ryerson University who were trying to use GIS data to match filming locations to the actual productions of film and figure out how cities on films actually get mapped and plotted, which is completely independent of what architects think or what filmmakers think, if you see what I mean. So there are lots of good stuff going on about the intersection of how you make a building and how you make a film, and thinking about it afterwards. I don't think there's a should there. It's a really interesting moment when people are really trying to understand lots of things. So for example, there's all of these films that are, I guess Berlin Symphony is maybe the famous one, where you kind of celebrate the city in a film. And there's just so many of them now that is an entire scholarly endeavor to try to figure out how those films get made and so on. And in the days of TikTok, we just barely scratched the surface of how much filmmaking about cities is actually going on as we're speaking. We're just not going to be able to do it in the same way that we do it for our show.
Is that not should, or film doesn't have a certain kind of responsibility to the city or to architecture, but it does have a huge impact on it, in a sense that through all of these, especially TV shows, that all of a sudden you have a film that's 30 hours long instead of 2.5. There's a certain kind of city building that happens in films, and kind of our memories and understanding and kind of stories that build how we remember cities that we've never been to, or how we remember cities that we've been to. The storytelling in film has a huge responsibility to how we perceive or remember these things, both from the idea of creating things that don't exist. Again, one of our interviewees loves to talk about how, there's only one alley in New York City, and yet we think of New York as this kind of gritty city full of alleyways and fire escapes, and it doesn't exist. Those are Canadian alleyways. But our memory of New York is that, or the famous Japanese Paris syndrome of Japanese tourists who get very upset when they go to Paris because it doesn't live up to what they know Paris to be from what they've imagined or seen through the storytelling in films, or for example in Roma. That part.
Yeah, true. Like Roma was a revolution. You wouldn't even, I mean, half the things about the space were not as we ever knew.
Yeah, but again, it's someone trying to rebuild his memory of that part of Mexico City that doesn't exist in reality. It's part of it is real, most of it is his memory. So you have this kind of fiction that's made through CGI, and it's black and white, so obviously you believe it as being authentic. But beyond you being duped, here's a creator who's trying to rebuild his memories of a city and show them to you. And that's how you understand that part of Mexico City if you've never been there. And then you go there and you kind of add your layers to it. And if ever you make a movie about Mexico City, that part of it, that fiction, is also going to get impregnated into your kind of reimagining of it or your storytelling of it. So I think we're kind of building this other kind of global city, whether some of it's generic, some of it's very specific, that is ours, and that's not necessarily physically real, but it's more real than the actual cities that exist. And I think that's kind of one of the beautiful discoveries of Impostor Cities, is this kind of global city that we share, that we've never been to.
If we flip it around and we say, okay, that was the Impostor City as projected on our cinema, and now we're going to make a reality. And actually, what was projected, you end up building it.
Well, I mean, in CGI, it is built. All of it is, it built at some point. We're going to accept that.
In reality, if you end up building it, what would it be like? I mean, it's the same.
But we are building it. That's the thing. It's every time as architects that we build, we can't not be influenced by this global imposter city that filmmakers have made. That's kind of how we see cities. That's how we react, and we're designing based on that. What David was saying, how it's, we're building this generic city that is founded on the storytelling. Whether it brings us closer together, it would be nice to think, yeah.
Yeah, it might just. Disney World brought a lot of people together, so you don't know. So, while you were doing research on this, or did you get a research? Did you speak to some of the inhabitants who could be living in some of those Canadian architecture or Canadian buildings, which either were blown up on a screen or recreated or doubled up on the screen? Could you get a chance to speak to some of those people who are actually working or living in that city?
That's part two of our research project. So first part was the filmmakers. Actually, David and I wrote a grant specifically about Arthur Erickson's work, looking at that exact topic. So it's a gift that keeps on giving, this project.
Wow! So I preempted something.
We had this sort of initial very, very strong story, and we just thought we could get people to tell us more about how filming in the cities actually worked, and why did you choose these locations, and what went wrong, and so on. And filmmakers that so far that we've got tended not to think of their own work the way that we were looking at it. So that still leaves a story, like, how do these buildings get chosen? Some of it's fairly mundane. It has to do with whether they've been used before, whether somebody has the keys. University of British Columbia in Vancouver is the 9th most used filming location in the world, number 9. And the reasons are complicated, but one of the reasons is because they will let you film there, and they will encourage you to film there, and they will charge you money for it, and it's easy to get the permits, and it's easy. They have a wide variety of architecture that can be easily made to look like elsewhere. So when you asked filmmakers the question, they turned into these really boring answers often about why this was what's actually going on. But for me, there still remains this mystique of these possible stories about what happens when you actually make a film. So normally you just worry about the kind of garbage that they leave behind in the streets when they want to make it look like New York. That's a kind of normal one. Why didn't they clean up after themselves? But almost everybody has this idea of, well, I was at the coffee shop and, Harrison Ford was there having coffee, and that kind of change to their daily lives where the world of cinema comes back to the city, not so much in designing architecture, but just your sense of what the city is gets influenced not just by the film, but by the filmmaking process. So it's, architects can learn from that. I really do think different ways of thinking about what they do, that it's not just, oh, well, the bathrooms go here and, I'm going to get this contractor to do this. And I got extra budget so I can have nice wide plank oak floors now, and so on. There's other parts of it that are, properly speaking, cultural or social and not just architectural. Film helps us to see that.
So David and Tom, how far do you and the medium of film go? And from this, I will spring to the second part of this question. Why isn't Impostor Cities a book or a research paper? Is it about greater accessibility or reaching this medium of film, reaching out to the masses for your message of Canadian cities being impostered?
I mean, a book is definitely on the way.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a research project that is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Just because there's such a wealth of questions that come out of it. Every time you try and answer one question, 3 more pop up. So yeah, we're looking forward to a book. We had talked about an academic conference about the topic where we'd like to invite other people who are interested in it as well. I mean, we can't be the only ones. So try and open up the discourse and the discussion academically, but also kind of, I think what is interesting about the project is just how accessible and fun it is in some ways too. So we wouldn't want to lose that aspect of it by trying to make it too academically oriented.
And I would add one of the things that I really learned from Tom doing this is that we really planned it for the actual pavilion that we would use, the Canadian pavilion in the Giardini in Venezia, and for the people that we thought would be there. So everyone from school children being forced to be there, to international journalists, to friends, really thinking about who the audience who would really see it would be, and that it would actually be an experience, not just a bunch of panels that told you something. You would actually experience something, this thing that I'm talking about, which we shortened to this word movie mode, where you would actually feel like you're somehow part of cinema rather than directly part of architecture. So the actual exhibition had this very specific place and experience in mind. And the importance of having the experience, not just a bunch of panels that tell you how many films are made or who the architects were or who the designers were, but something that you could actually, with your entire body, as we like to say in architecture, kind of walk through it, and it would cause you to imagine yourself differently or imagine your world slightly differently. The actual experience of it would do that. So that's different from doing research into the topic and coming up with some kind of contribution, but we hope that they're related. And the actual techniques that we've begun working on for how do you show these films about architecture, we hope to also be working on not just the ideas, but the actual, how do you, I still have this backseat of the airplane situation in mind, which is partly how I get to see some of these bad films, not even watching your own, you can look out and you can see 5 films at once because you're looking at everybody's different. I'm sure you've done that.
Yeah.
You can see everybody's films.
Yeah.
So that's kind of partly one of the things we had in mind with our experience. You wouldn't just be watching one film and analyzing it. You'd be amongst a whole bunch of films. and that experience is still, we think, worth developing as well as an experience, not just as a intellectual research project. So there's those two parts. Book is coming, but hopefully more exhibitions are coming too.
No, it's like your website, you can't separate everything out.
You preempted the question we were keen to ask you. What is the format? How big is the pavilion? And how do you enter? What is the experience like? You're going to create screens? Is there like a virtual reality movement from watching one movie to the other, or like you're sitting on a seat of in a plane and watching 5 movies together?
It's not virtual reality, but it's supposed to instill some other reality. Coming back to the airplane metaphor, when you watch a movie on an airplane, you feel it differently. Something that you wouldn't normally laugh at, for some reason on a movie you laugh. Something that you wouldn't normally cry about, for some reason on a plane you do cry. It's weird. Watching a movie on a plane is a whole other experience that has never been matched anywhere in the real world. So we kind of wanted to do that in the pavilion. So it's a strange building. It's from the 1950s. It was designed by famous Italian architects who had some idea of what Canadian architecture was. Here we go again with the identity issues and the impostering. So it's this kind of nautilus seashell shape and plan. It has certain allusions to native architecture as well in section. And so you go through in this kind of spiral. There's a tree in the middle of it. So we're trying to create an experience that is somehow based on the shape of this building. And there's a series of screens at the heart of it that you kind of weave your way through, and you're surrounded by images of Canadian buildings reinterpreted. There's a ambisonic soundscape as well that kind of moves around the space and puts you in another receptive mode for what you're seeing. There's a didactic part of the exhibition as well that talks about the actual buildings towards the end, that kind of reorients what we call the architect's point of view in contrast to what you just experienced. And then I guess one other aspect of it is we're going to wrap part of the building in a green screen and have some AR effects as well that people can play around with on their phone. And the Italians' interpretation of Canadian architecture gets replaced with real Canadian architecture on people's cell phones.
It sounds interesting. This for sure sounds like, I'm sure it's going to be a great rush. We hope that everything goes normal and pandemic does not kill it. But
yes,
I for sure looking forward to spending time at the pavilion when we're there.
When two very powerful voices, creative minds come together, it's often conflict, as much as the convergence of ideas that causes the best work to appear. So what do you feel about teamwork?
We've kind of known each other and we know sort of how we work. So it's been easier in some ways. So we're not starting from scratch, creatively speaking. But yeah, people have different ideas. You try and hash things out. It's not easy, but at the same time, I don't think this is the kind of project, or I think most creative exercises are very difficult to do by yourself. You do need something to bounce ideas off, and it generally works better as a group than it does. Imagine trying to make a movie by yourself. It's possible, but it doesn't necessarily produce the best work.
Absolutely.
Teamwork did make the dream work. Did you note any instances where Impostor Cities was flipped? Do you remember any other city filling in for a Canadian city?
Interesting. I'll have to get back to you on that. That's we've been kind of in our own world, looking at the binoculars in one direction. We'll try turning them around and look in the other one. It's a lot of. I think especially here in Quebec, where people are very particular about cultural identity, you know, I think the last one that I remember is Marion Cotillard trying to do a Quebecois accent. That caused a huge uproar here. People were playing it on every news channel, kind of commenting on her interpretation of the French-Canadian accent, or a Parisian's interpretation of a French-Canadian accent. But I'll have to think about what, I'll get back to you about a city.
Yeah, I'll be looking forward to that. Yeah.